I was 7 years old when Kennedy was assassinated, and I was at home in bed, sick with the flu, watching TV, watching cartoons, and my TV show was interrupted, and this news flash came on. And that's probably the first time I'd witnessed, an interruption in TV for a news flash. Very short time after that, I heard our neighbor run into the house and calling for my mother, and immediately my mother and the neighbor I heard sobbing, and that was the first time I'd heard my mother crying. So we have a lot of just firsts for a 7-year-old to take in. One Red Rose started with my desire to compose a piece for the Brentano String Quartet. And I worked with them over the last 2 decades in many contexts. I performed with them in my works for electric guitar and string quartet, and they recorded works of mine, but I hadn't actually composed a big piece for them. After hearing them in concert year after year, I really wanted a chance to explore their attention to detail and their just musical understanding and intuition and commitment, and I know the individuals very well, and that's always a kind of a special place to be when you're composing for people that you really know personally and musically. So the association with the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination came separately. That was actually Seth Knopf from the Nasher Center who suggested that, or asked me if I'd be willing to write a piece for that occasion. And he and I put the Brentano idea together with the Kennedy idea, and I think it's a perfect match. I mean, the string quartet as a medium is so capable of so many complex and nuanced things that it seemed like something that, for lack of a better word, could show the appropriate amount of respect for the occasion. So the piece was commissioned by the Nasher Center, the Yellow Barn Music Festival, and Carnegie Hall. One Red Rose is in 3 movements. The first is called 5 Short Studies, which it is what it is. The second is called Fugue and Fantasy, and the last movement is called Anthem and Aria. Those are all very objective titles, which I think contrast to the more poetic title of the piece as a whole. As I started work on the piece, I started to do some research. The research at first sort of backfired, because one of my first thoughts was, well, this is just too big for art, in the way that the other big news story of my lifetime, 9/11, seems too big for art. It's too impersonal in a way. Another problem I had was it was such a tragedy, and there's so much horror in it, and if you watch video, it's such an horrific event that I wanted the piece to not be filled with just ugliness and anger, my own anger, that the fabric of American, my own parents, personal lives, but also the fabric of the American society in 1963 was torn asunder by this one crazy act. Whether you think it was Oswald acting alone or a conspiracy, still one bullet changed everything. And as I was paralyzed until I realized that it didn't have to. I don't have to depict the event. I didn't have to depict the ugliness of the event. And what came back to me was that first reaction I had as a child. This idea that this event was simultaneously a huge public event and a private event. It broke into the news, yet my mother, for the first time that I'd heard her, was crying, took it very personally. And my subsequent research with the project, with the events, kept reinforcing that idea that this is something that's personal to people. People all over the world, in a public way, were being notified, but they would stop, and be introspective, and think about what this meant for them. And in particular, I started to think about Jackie and what this meant for her, because as a public, her president was also assassinated, but it was her husband and the mother of her two small children. She was there. She was inches away from him when the fatal bullet hit. She showed great courage, leaping on the back of the limousine to try to grab some of JFK's skull, thinking it might be helpful. She comforted him, did not leave his side. She had to endure a lot, going to Air Force One, standing by Johnson's side as a new president is being sworn in. And I also thought of her at the state funeral, where she showed grace and poise and allowing an opportunity for the whole world really to get some kind of closure on this event. In fact, that was the source of the music that I wrote first. Ends up being the third movement of the piece, which is called Anthem and Aria. The anthem refers to the kind of public grieving, very ritualized, following a very strict protocol that we use to kind of be respectful, but to keep emotion sort of checked in a way, to make it accessible to a public. And that sort of, that's an anthem is a very public kind of music. Aria comes from opera, and it's where a character expresses personal feelings. And so this idea of anthem and aria really distills the idea that runs throughout the piece of this kind of flipping back and forth or simultaneous two strata of the public sense of the event, public grieving, and personal tragedy, which it was to those members of Kennedy's family, including Jackie. Related, not unrelated anyway, is this idea of control and chaos. The chaos of the time, but the control of the manhunt and the forensic investigations that went on. The second movement is called Fugue and Fantasy, which does flip back and forth between this idea of public and private, sort of slips into Jackie's head. That's sort of my metaphor. My governing metaphor is sort of Jackie's internal timelessness, as how can this be happening, which we've all experienced, and then flips back into this hurried, hectic, harried chaos of rushing the president to the hospital and searching for the shooter, and reporters running to their phones and their teletype machines. But it also, in that same sort of continuum is this idea of control and poise on one hand and chaos on the other. And Fugue and Fantasy sort of distills that, I think. Fugue is in one sense the most organized sort of form of music. It's very kind of strict procedures that one follows. On the other, Fantasy, on the other hand, suggests freedom and abandon, but the character of my fantasy is actually quite restrained and introspective. So all those ideas sort of come to play. I used specific elements of the events to sort of fuel character, but it's probably best that the listener doesn't even know specific associations. I think it's best and truly, for me, most important that those ideas of personal, public, chaotic versus control are sort of windows into the piece. I should mention where the title comes from, One Red Rose. I encountered One Red Rose as a footnote in a book about the events, reporting that the Secret Service agent that searched the limousine, the presidential limousine, following the assassination when the president was taken into the emergency room, only found one blood-soaked red rose on the floorboards of the limousine. And I found that a very poetic image. I also thought it sort of tipped my hand in contrast to the very objective titles of the movements. In some way I'm focusing as much on Jackie as on the assassination itself, and that comes from the inspiration, and the red rose comes from this very iconic photograph of the President and the First Lady when they first arrive in Dallas. She's presented with a bouquet of roses, and at the end of the day, only this one rose is left on the floorboard. Somehow that also spoke to me as this idea of the singular, the personal, the intimate, the single red rose, in contrast to the bouquet, the group, the many. A bouquet is very different than one red rose. So I hope that gives you some insight into the piece, some handles on how to get into it. Ultimately, the piece should be a convincing landscape of sounds and rhythms and timbres. But I did want people to know it's my efforts to sort of connect it to this watershed event in American history.